Hello guys, Jacob here, and today we're going to talk about whether or not we as individuals have free will, despite the fact that God is all-knowing.
Hello, Hellbound friends. GodlessIowan here, and yes, we're doing another Pando video. I'm not sure if I do these videos because I enjoy them, or just the fact that Jacob's last name closely resembles Panda, and I love those. But anyway, I thought to myself, why should I have all the fun? Why not make this a collab and get someone else in on the fun? But who could help me with this video? Who?
Hello guys, Jacob here, and today we're going to talk about whether or not we as individuals have free will, despite the fact that God is all-knowing.
We really ought to be starting with whether or not God exists, but if we have to grant that proposition to even discuss this topic, fine, let's do this. Greetings, fellow space travelers, BionicDance here. So, free will. If you know me, you already know my feelings on this one. If you don't, here's the short version. I think it's an illusion. I'm sure we'll get more into why before this is all over.
And we would be in complete agreement on that, BionicDance, though that wasn't always the case for me. I used to be a strong proponent of free will even after leaving the faith. Like you said, though, we'll get more into that later.
I want to talk to you a little bit about what determinism means, okay, in a naturalistic worldview. A worldview where all that exists is natural processes, okay, and nature. There is no spirit, there is no higher power, okay. Now in this worldview, everything is determined because all the reactions in our head, the chemicals, the processes, everything that we think, everything that we believe that we have control over is based on natural processes just running in our heads. You know, it's not about anything. It just does what it does. It's an engine, I guess you could say, is a type of engine. And it runs on these chemicals.
Told you we'd get to why I think that free will is an illusion. In order to have free will, we need to be able to override the natural world to do something that the physical structures and activities of our head meats wouldn't do if they were allowed to take their natural course. And that would, by definition, require something supernatural, which nobody has ever shown to exist.
Exactly. True free will would mean wanting, desiring, and intending to do one thing while actually deciding to do the exact opposite. Now, does this mean that we have no choice in anything? Of course not. But what it does mean is that our choices are made prior to us even realizing that we've made that choice. Our basic urges of hunger, thirst, sexual desires, and other needs are ingrained into our minds before anything else, and they are those same urges that guide most of our decisions throughout our lives.
And so, in an atheist worldview, these chemicals, they do not have a spirit. We don't have control over it. We are these chemicals. Everything comes down to chemical reactions, okay?
Little nitpicky, but actually important point. Atheism refers only to belief in a god or gods. Unlikely as it may be, an atheist could believe in magic, sorcery, witchcraft, or souls, just as long as a god isn't in the picture. So technically this isn't an atheist worldview, it's a naturalistic worldview.
Thanks for making that point, Kate. When I left the faith and stopped believing in God, I still believed in many things that are associated with faith. I was an atheist, but it took me time for my belief in the soul and definitely my belief in free will to go out the window. I know hundreds of atheists that are still adamantly against my own views on free will. It's a tough topic to really contend with, which is why there is such a diverse spectrum of opinions on the subject. So Jacob, you're wrong. Just because a person is an atheist doesn't mean that they do not believe in free will. I don't, and Kate doesn't, but many others do.
So, in an atheist worldview, determinism is perfectly logical, okay? But in a theist worldview, we believe that we have a spirit, and we base this spirit on our acknowledgement of our ability to have free will, our ability to have control over our thoughts, over our actions, and everything doesn't just come down to natural processes, okay?
You acknowledge it. How about you justify it with evidence? Because that's the thing about illusions. They're awfully convincing until you look behind the curtain and see the guy pulling the strings. And so far nobody, religious or otherwise, has been able to show us that there is more than what we see, that there is anything other than nature.
And on top of all that, the more we know about nature, the more things that used to be assigned to the supernatural are now assigned to the natural. Not once has a natural occurrence been replaced by a supernatural one. You're never going to hear an article stating, "Well, we once thought that thunder was a result of heated and rapidly expanding air due to lightning. We've now learned that it's actually Thor's hammer." That's just not going to happen.
So now that we've gone over that, I'm going to give you a quick analogy of what we believe free will is based on, okay? And free will is based on the individual, okay? So here I have a dice, okay?
No, actually, it's not okay. What you have is a die. Dice is plural. You have no idea how much that pisses me off.
That glaring error aside, I can't wait to see what Jacob is going to say here. His awful analogy of Sci-Tin Booger Cake Soda Pop analogy in a previous video was the joy of my life. Anyway, go on, Jacob. Please tell us about the die.
I have a dice that I made, and let's say that I am God, okay? And I roll this dice. This dice represents humanity. So I'm God, and this dice represents humanity. And if I roll this dice, okay, I roll this dice, and it lands to be a 1. Does that mean that I determined when I wrote this dice that it would be a 1?
Have you ever heard the expression, God does not play dice with the universe? It's an often misunderstood quote from Albert Einstein. The misunderstood part is that people thought he was saying he believed in a God, which he absolutely did not by his own explicit statement. What he was getting at was that the universe appears to be running on its own, that even if there was a God, it would be one that had kick-started the world and then just let it take its own course, unimpeded, without interference or influence. But it didn't need a God for that. Even a roll of a die is subject to the laws of the universe. It's not random. Humans just lack the mental computing power to predict the outcome of their throw. Mind you, the quote was in response to his denial of quantum physics, but that's a story for another time. His basic premise was essentially correct.
Yes, I think I know where Jacob is going to try and go with this, but to address his initial point, if you throw a die and you know all things, past, present, and future, as well as having direct control over all things past, present, and future, then it doesn't matter where the die lands, because you knew exactly where it was going to land. So if this analogy is going to say that God created the die, but it's our free will that decides where it would land, your God still doesn't get an out, because he already knew where it would land. This does point out the reasoning for the free will argument. It's to give God a scapegoat for why suffering exists in this world. God cannot be all good and have a world where suffering exists, unless you push the reason for that suffering away from God and onto the created beings. It's an excuse and pretty much nothing more.
Using an analogy in the physical realm, but in the reality that God lives in, that goes beyond space-time, I'm guessing he uses a different type of mechanism, okay? He uses a free-willed spirit, which he gives all of us.
And the reason we should believe that is...
Oh, I know the reason for this, Kate. It's stuffing thing.
So let's add the concept of a free-willed spirit into our dice analogy, okay? Now let's say I gave this dice free will. I gave it a spirit, an ability to move on its own. So let's say I roll this dice and it rolls a 1. Okay, let's say this is a yes, that God does exist. This dice believes God does exist. But then it can decide on its own to move and to become a no. It could become a 6. And let's say the 6-sided dice means that this individual does not believe in a God.
Oh, this is so bad.
So you are like this dice. It is a self-sustained mechanism, a self-sustainable individual who determines on their own what they will do. But I, being God, can see your future.
Not just see the future, but could also see all possible futures regardless of what choice you make. This is why you'll hear Christians proudly proclaim that nothing can go against God's plan. So regardless of what choice is made in any given situation, God's plan is unchanged.
You see, because God, the way God sees time, he sees it the same way as us human beings look at the past. Because since God lives outside of space-time, okay, let's say this book represents the universe. It represents space-time, okay? And as I flip through these pages, time progresses. Time continues, okay?
God is outside of space and time, which means what? Is there something outside of space-time? Can you prove that anything is outside of space-time? You're not going to touch on any of this, but go on.
So, despite the fact that time is continuing, we can see that the entire book is still here. Okay. Now, Einstein, before he died, he believed that concepts of the past, the present, and the future were all simultaneously existing in different realities, parallel universes, okay, in a sense. That's just another example, but he believed that these ideas of present, past, and future were all sort of illusory, and that, in fact, you could compare space-time to a book, okay?
You're going to see a poll pop up at the end, but I really doubt if Jacob has read anything by Einstein or any of the people that he mentions in this video, since that is probably the worst explanation of space-time that I've ever heard.
So, God sees our present and our future the same way that we look at the past. God has already read the entire book. Okay, he read your book. He saw, and guess what it's based on? It's based on yourself. It's based on the individual.
What does that even mean? Do we each have our own book? What about interactions with other people? What about interactions with the rest of the universe? Shouldn't there be only one book, one for the universe as a whole? How can there be a so-called book based on the individual when the series is going to have crossovers and spin-offs based on what the rest of the universe does to us and what we do to it?
Excellent point, Kate. Let's take this video here as an example. For you and I to collab on this video, we had to meet and interact. We had to enjoy each other's content enough to feel comfortable working with one another, and the fact that we're working together on this means that we have eliminated any other possibility of what we could have done had we not done this collab. You may have had other plans for the time that it took to make this video, and I could have as well. But the fact that we interacted eliminated a portion of the choices we would be able to make during the making of this video. Our crossover has disrupted both of our timelines, and without that taken into play, any god would have an incomplete picture of the entire situation.
Alright, every action that you will do will happen because you individually will cause those actions to happen. Alright, no one's causing those actions for you. So you are the determining factor for your future.
But what am I? If not those natural processes, if not my brain's behavior based on the meat and chemicals that make it go, then what gives me the power of decision-making? A soul? How can we know that such a thing exists? And if my alleged book is already written, if God can see it from beginning to end, how do I have the power of choice? The future is already set. My choices are made for me by that book. The only way free will could exist is if the book doesn't exist or is still being written. And even then, free will is not definitely real.
And therein lies the true problem of free will. If space-time is already played out, then we aren't making any decisions. They've all already been made. If the book exists, then free will doesn't exist. If the book doesn't exist and God doesn't know how things are going to play out, then God cannot possibly be all-knowing. Free will was an excuse to give God an out, but in reality it only adds more issues to the equation.
There you go, guys. So even Michio Kaku believes, based on the Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, that with the future being mostly probabilistic, that our future is not determined, okay?
Well, so what? I can find other scientists, like MIT physicist Scott Aaronson, who will say that quantum mechanics, uncertainty, doesn't give us free will. And why should it? Even if the future is not preordained because natural systems are occasionally given a jolt, that just means that the path has been changed, like a river being forced around a rock, or any dice you've thrown landing in different spots because of a gust of wind. It doesn't change how the universe works. Everything will eventually even out, including our brains. It doesn't give us the power of choice. And don't give me any of this mass murderer crapola either. If a murderer can't be blamed for his crimes because he had no choice, we can't be blamed for punishing him because we had no choice either. Why does everyone who makes that argument overlook that part?
I'm so glad you made that point, Kate. It does seem to be the go-to argument whenever anyone says anything against the idea of free will. Sam Harris in his book Free Will actually brings this up. Sam Harris in his book Free Will actually brings this up and says much the same as what you have here. Even if the murderer had no real choice in their decision, we would still have no choice but to segregate those people away from the rest of society. This is due to what we've talked about before in this video, crossovers. If you have someone that is killing people, you want to prevent them from crossing over into the timelines of as few people as possible. And so we imprison these people and keep them locked away from society. We wouldn't simply let murderers roam free because they had no free will in the matter. That's just ridiculous.
And God, simply because God can see present, past, and future all simultaneously does not mean that he determines for us our actions. Just because you can look at the past actions of an individual, right, in their bibliographies, does not mean that you determined for those individuals what they would do.
How do you know any of this? Why should I believe it? Don't just assert it. Convince me.
Jacob, convince someone? Oh, you give him too much credit, Kate.
In this worldview, we all have a spirit. And that spirit, after processing information, would send signals to the brain, and then the brain would react based on whatever the spirit decided to do.
And here's where it makes no sense. Why do you need the spirit? Remove the spirit and the brain is still sending and receiving information constantly that direct our thoughts and actions. You don't need something outside of you to be you. Even if free will did exist, you wouldn't need a god. You would simply need something supernatural intervening on your behalf. That supernatural thing could be a soul, or hell, it could even be the Force, but it wouldn't need to be a god, let alone your god, Jacob.
So free will is perfectly observable in a theist worldview.
It's only observable if you decide that certain things are true first, certain things that are not observable, like the existence of this alleged spirit.
Just think of me, for example, writing on a schedule. Let's say I schedule that tomorrow I want to go to the movies at 3 p.m. Okay? And then when that time comes, I act on that desire, on that intentionality that I had the previous day. So that's perfect. There's perfect examples of free will taking place.
How is that free will? You wrote that you were going to do something and then you did it. Did you have a choice to write it? Did you have a choice to even want it? There's no observable free will here.
Yes, Kate. Jacob here seems to think that free will is simply planning and executing an action. But let's take a look at that movie example. You write it down. I'm going to go to the movies tomorrow. You wake up ready to go to the movies. You get dressed, you head out your door, and the second you get into your car, your cell phone rings. It's your mother telling you that your father just had a heart attack and is in the hospital. Now, to go with your example, Jacob, you would take in this new information and yet still go to the movies, as that was your free will decision. But more than likely, you'll still instead rush to the hospital to be with your father. You had no choice in the situation that occurred, and your feelings for your father will override your desire to go to the movies. You don't really have a choice in this matter. You just do it.
So a common analogy that's often used to give you a depiction of this is that of a pre-recorded football game. Okay, so let's say you had to run to the store, and you didn't have time to watch this game. So you went ahead and pre-recorded this football game using your TiVo. Okay, and so you come back home, the game's over, but it's not over for you because you haven't seen the game yet. Okay, so while you're while you're pressing play to watch the game progresses, right? Time progresses in that game, despite the fact that the game has already ended. Despite the fact that the football game had already ended, you're able to flip through the time to observe each moment in that game.
Except, of course, you could check the score, or if you're like me, a friend will text you with the score and run the game in its entirety. Thanks, Bob. Thanks so much.
Okay, so that's kind of how God sees our reality. He sees past, present, and future as events that have already occurred. Okay, we're just in the motion of that game completing. All right.
Still not seeing the free will here. When was there a possibility for any of this to be different? And how would that difference be our doing?
Exactly. Free will would state that even though the game has been pre-recorded and you, being God, are watching it after its conclusion, having the game turn out differently than it did when it was first recorded. So even though the Patriots actually won the game, you watching it after the fact could have the possibility of the Chiefs winning instead. And each time it played out for you, a different result could occur.
So guys, you tell me, what do you think about my analogies and about my arguments?
They're crap. Until next time, fellow space travelers, this is BionicDance.
And this has been the Godless Iowan. Thank you to BionicDance for helping me out with this collab. If you're watching this on my channel, please head over to Kate's channel and subscribe to her. If you're watching on her channel, please head over to my channel and subscribe to me. Please, please do it. Also, Jacob, your analogies are not getting any better. They suck. They really, truly suck. Anyway, if you liked this, hit the like button, smush the subscribe button, and share. Don't panic. Remember, folks, you're not alone.